All set. Okay, so I call this special meeting to order. Well, Ms. Dean, would you do the roll call
Council President Suzanne M. Salder,
here?
Councilperson Brian M. Madaway,
Here.
Councilperson Andrew Zelt,
Here.
Councilperson Joseph F. Day,
Here.
also present Antonina Tantillo, City Administrator, Mayor Valerie Leary, Michael Hoffman, City Solicitor, Christopher Rogers, City Planner.
Thank you. Okay, well, the first item on the agenda is public comments. So if anyone wishes to speak, the podium, there's a sign-in sheet. The usual rules, you have, please at least say your name and put your name and address on the sheet, and then you have 3 minutes.
Front row seat here.
They're gonna think I'm you now. Sorry.
Yes, my name is Tom Whitehead, Second Street. I had 2 items. I wanted to bring up the fact we're talking about bed and breakfast. And I just want to give you an example that I had probably 15 years ago. And was really nothing in place then, but not far from Charlotte County Corner across the street from me. They had 4 union people, nothing against them, 4 nice guys. They all had pickup trucks. They rented this house from Mrs. Deemer. They all had their own bedrooms. And I like to say, yeah, I'm not against the bed and breakfast, but there can be situations where it can really foul up the traffic. And that was one of them. A couple of guys after I said something, some of the neighbors after a while, they did move their trucks down the street where the parking was. You know, and you know, it was resolved, but that can be a problem. And I'm hoping that when you go through this, you know, that's something that can jump up and it's hard to get rid of. The other thing, last time, I guess, whenever it was a month ago, we'll say, we were talking, what the heck was it? Oh, about the number of bed and breakfast. There was a discussion with Mr. Manaway and Mrs. Satter went on and on. And we were talking about the number went up to 14. And I remember Mr. Zelt saying, you know, there should be some compromise with that. Bring it down to 4 or 5. You did say that, right, Brian?
Yes, sir. I think there was a discussion, I think you're referring to maybe the city council meeting where.
Yeah, there were,
Discussion, some
in other words, it was
around-
prorated amongst all the, you know, all the towns, and I'm hoping there can be a compromise on that. I'm not against it. But like 14 would be just too many. So that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
City Ordinance 555 has created a lot of contentious debate. One reason, I believe, is that the details of the ordinance are raising basic factual questions that need a lot more thought and objective research, local research, to find an answer. They're difficult questions that are being raised by the proposal. And until that research and thinking is done, that debate is going to be fought with personal opinions. And the city risks enacting out of touch ordinances that bear no reality to the community that we live in. So how do we define a short-term rental right now? In trying to pin down what exactly constitutes a short-term rental and what business model is it targeting, the ordinance creates a rather confusing set of definitions, categories, limitations, and exceptions. For example, the definitions and associated regulations, as they stand proposed, would shut down the few existing short-term rentals because they specify that a short-term rental can't have a guest for more than 270 days of the year. Doesn't fit in any business model that I'm aware of. At the same time, there are several really important types of housing arrangements that it doesn't address yet. For instance, they're not in or out of any of our present definitions, like housing exchange, transitional workers, roommates, occasional renters, somebody rent once or twice a year. If we really believe we should regulate this type of activity, then it seems to me that we should think through the categories more carefully and nail them down. Develop useful definitions and estimates of the number of properties that we're talking about in each category. So one question is, what's the 2.5% rule actually based on? The assumption behind much of the debate is that short-term rentals are going to completely erode our present social fabric. It's going to be unrecognizable within a year or two. Nobody has presented any evidence that the existing short-term rentals are having that impact right now. And the erosion that's being feared must require a certain number above and beyond what we have right now, because that's not happening. The proposed ordinance includes the following: no more than 2.5% of the total residential parcels in any zoning district shall be issued to short-term rental licenses. We're unable to find any existing research in any community that supports that figure. Although some studies indicate negative effects, they're really careful to suggest that it's a correlation, not causation. And they emphasize that thresholds will vary by local context. Thank you.
Try not to steal the pen this time. Another example of an issue that might need more thinking and research is the allocation of quotas. The ordinance establishes quotas by district. It's become clear that a fixed percentage per district is awkward at best, as it underrepresents the commercial and gateway districts, which might be good candidates for short-term rentals, while allowing more short-term rentals in other districts than are ever likely to be established. If limits are proposed, they need to be allocated thoughtfully across the whole community based on local research and city goals. Also, the proposed ordinance includes extremely detailed requirements ranging from insurance to signage to fire and safety, building and electrical, kind of complex licensing and so forth. Now, many people who object to short-term rentals profess to be concerned about non-occupant managers, people who rent multiple units all year round. But amateur, what we might call amateur occupant owners who are only renting one unit occasionally are less likely to have the time, money, or expertise to implement all these requirements. So the ordinance is more likely to discourage owner-occupied short-term rentals, leaving the potential market to multi-unit managers, which is the opposite effect of what was intended. Finally, in fact, many communities that have implemented short-term rental regulations have succeeded in reducing their number, but when they go back to measure the original problem that was the excuse for the ban, they find little or no effect. One of the most puzzling questions is parking. It's difficult, it's a really difficult issue in town, but the ordinance might be using it for the wrong reasons. As written, each unit is required to have an off-street parking spot. This is presumably based on the assumption that short-term rentals generate more parking per unit than if it were an owner-occupied or a long-term rental. In fact, we could find no surveys anywhere to support this. And it is intuitively non-obvious. A typical owner-occupied house might have 2 or more cars attached, whereas a couple visiting in town, for the day probably will have only 1. If the short-term rental is only booked 50% of the time, that further reduces the parking demand. So a short-term rental conversion may represent less parking demand rather than more. More thought and research may be required to understand how all of these regulations and requirements actually affect who can start a short-term rental, how equitable the program is, and what, if any, are the real benefits of the regulations to the community. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, then we'll end our public comment. I would like to propose that we just go through the ordinance section by section and discuss any questions we have about it. And as we get to sections that are addressed by the proposed amendments, then we can discuss those amendments in that context. Does that seem reasonable?
It does, and the only thing that I would ask different in this workshop and prior workshop is if we can get some direction, not voting, but some direction from council on edits so that we can avoid the multiple amendment situation at a future meeting.
Before that, can I hit one area that's not from a step-by-step scenario? So I did a search in our code and everything that's out there. There's a chapter 140 called Housing and Property Maintenance, and it has Article 2 and all this terminology. It contradicts the things that we're defining here. They have boarding housing, lodging house, tourist house, and they also have hotel, they have motel, they have rooming house and rooming unit. And to me, it's like, I know it's a different part of our code, but here we're defining something and that we have something else that contradicts it. And I don't know if that needs to be updated to pull this together, but it doesn't work together, especially when we have differences in what we're trying to put out there.
I think the key thing to keep in mind is that the codes, the chapter, they're going to be enforced based on the chapter. And so the challenge that you're going to run into is that if that becomes the North Star, if you want all definitions to be uniform, then you're going to have additional conflicts because inherently different chapters are going to be defined differently. And one example, a lot of your building codes comes from the ICC codes, which have, a very different set of definitions. So I think it's a fair observation, but I think in practice, you'll find that that's actually a lot more difficult and impractical than it may seem on the surface.
Wow, to me, it's setting us up for a contradiction and lawsuits when we have differences here.
From the lawsuits that again, the chapter, you're going to enforce the chapter per the chapter. So when you're looking to the zoning code, you're going to look to the zoning code definitions. So again, I think it's a fair observation. I'm not as concerned on the lawsuit.
I'm not in agreement with that. To me, we should have, we're one community and we've got major differences. And then like here, rooming house, rooming unit. that's not defined in what we're putting out here. So there's definitely huge differences.
Well, maybe we can address some of that, as we go through. If that's okay, we'll just go through the ordinance and,
Okay, but it was just not part of it, it was just something.
right, I know,
separate.
that's a sort of a broad.
Yes,
Okay, so the first section is the definition of short-term rental. Which defines it as a house, duplex, apartment, condominium, or other residential dwelling unit or part thereof where guests rent sleeping or living accommodations of less than 31 days, such as Airbnb, VRBO, or other similar rental accommodations. I guess my questions about this one are twofold. First of all, later on in the ordinance, it says that the 31 days could be renewed to 62 days or 60 days. So how does that work? And secondly, if we mention specifics like Airbnb and VRBO, which 5 years from now may not exist anymore in their current form, does that cause problems? Could we just potentially say rents sleeping or living accommodations for short term, or, without getting into the number of days and eliminating the reference to specific platforms that may not exist in the future?
I think my understanding from the planning commission's review, Council President, is that they wanted to be clear that, anything that is longer than 31 days is not a short-term rental. So that 31 days becomes important, recognizing there can be a renewal, but a renewal is a different situation than you signing up for something that's longer than 31 days. So my understanding is the planning commission was intentional about the 31 days for that purpose, recognizing that then the impact is if you're above 31 days, you're not a short-term rental. And you have to have some point where you are going to apply what a short-term rental is. The comment on Airbnb Verbo is a good one. It is anytime you're dealing with cross-references, it's my little, it's my pet peeve comes up. However, sometimes they are important. And one of the values of having this type of a cross-reference in the short-term rental definition is it provides context. It provides context of what you're talking about. It doesn't say that an Airbnb, that you're relying specific as a cross-reference on that thing. It's offering an example to help in the definition. So I would review that such as aiding the definition. And I think that if you remove it, you potentially detract from providing clarity in terms of what is intended.
So I know it says such as, so it's not limited to.
Right. That's right.
So it provides a definition. of
Context and an
context.
example.
I appreciate that, and I think what's an invaluable word there, what comes next, similar, right? And to your point, Mr. Hoffman, in terms of context and spirit and the intent.
Correct.
I think the 31 days came about because most of the Airbnbs are like a long weekend or maybe a week. I'm not sure there's as much thought behind it as you're giving us credit.
Well, I think there was some conversation around differentiating it between a regular traditional rental
Right,
and then short-term rental,
right.
and putting some kind of time frame on it.
Right, but I mean, we've got a couple of things, like I know that one of the existing short-term rentals in town was rented within the past year, I'll say, for 6 weeks. Sometimes people come to town for a particular reason, to care for an elderly parent or for a work assignment. And we have other rentals in town that are rented from, I think, 30 to 90 days or 60 to 90 days, and they're geared towards traveling nurses or contractors who are in town to do work for one of the corporations in Wilmington. And people don't want to stay in a hotel for that length of time. They want something more home-like, and so they settle on something like this. We haven't addressed the 60 to 90 day range. It isn't a long-term rental, but it's not, it's outside this short-term rental definition.
I think we did have that conversation at the planning commission level, and correct me if you remember differently, but I think we did talk about that being a traditional, more of a traditional rental, and then the terms of the lease are up to the tenant and the landlord.
And I think that's what's important to kind of, as we kind of go through these as well, that the purpose behind this was to address additional regulations for short-term rentals. So you already have as an existing ability, the longer-term rentals, and you already have, that's, you're not creating that situation already exists. The question is carving out from that situation, a short-term rental, so that these regulations apply specifically to that. In order to do that, you have to put a cutoff someplace, and that's where I understand the number.
Okay. So are we saying we want to leave this as is?
I'm fine
Okay.
with the current definition and
Okay,
with everything, you evaluated.
okay, and then the next one is bed and breakfast. And as I see it, I'm not gonna read all of everything, and we'll be here all night, but as
It's up
I
on
see
the
it,
screen behind you too.
the primary distinction between bed and breakfast and short-term rental is that a bed and breakfast, as written, has to be owner occupied, and it doesn't have cooking facilities. Whereas a short-term rental is usually a whole unit, a house, a condo, an apartment, whatever, that does have cooking facilities. So those are the two distinctions. And they say no family or guest normally stays more than 7 nights. And again, the normally gives flexibility if somebody wanted to stay longer.
Well, I have the concern with the word normally. So again, I'm in a compliance world and normally gets ripped apart. So if we're putting in legislation, we shouldn't have the word normally in here. That just sets you up for failure. So it should be defined. Normally is such a non-committed word that you shouldn't have it in this. The second issue I have in this area is no more than 2 adults. What happens if the room has 2 queen beds or 2 full beds? Will that not be allowed? What happens if it has a couch that can pull out to have another bed? What happens if the adults have an adult child that has disabilities or things and they're with them? We're limiting the situation here. So
Yeah, and later it talks about 2 persons as opposed to 2 adults. And I think we have an amendment, a proposed amendment about that very issue.
what was that amendment?
Let's see,
Given as it changes to 2 persons, 2 adults.
Well,
later,
why do we have to have 2 adults?
but see, saying 2 adults doesn't limit if, for example, they had a child with them. But it doesn't deal with your issue of a disabled child.
There's lots of people
In
who have that
respect to the-
scenario.
In respect to, the disabled scenario, we want to be respectful of everyone and make sure that we're a welcoming city and place. Mr. Hoffman, would something like the American with Disabilities Act supersede or provide for allowances in these type of situations? Since we're talking about federal law, trumping, you know what I'm saying?
So I'd want to take a look at that specific question in
Okay.
terms of that specific issue. I mean, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but yes, the American with Disabilities Act is going to preempt that space and those regulations are going to apply. Whether that affects this definition, I'd want to take a look at.
Well, what if it is a big room and it has 2 beds? Are you telling them they can only have 2 adults? Why can't they have 4 adults? If they have 2 queen beds in there, 2 full beds, it's just, I'm just trying to understand this.
I'd imagine to a certain extent, it's looking in a similar vein as to occupancy of like long-term, right? Dealing with fire marshal and safety. I'd imagine there's some spirit or desire to not have 10 people in a room, right? And so how do we?
I was gonna say, doesn't the fire code have some?
Well, if there's room in there, it's a big, huge room. I don't
I
know
mean,
that has 2
No, I
queen
agree with
beds.
you.
It's-
Yeah.
We're restricting this and then you're not allowing them to to do that.
Why is it, so why doesn't it just be, let's take one and says has one bedroom and a fold-out couch? How many does that sleep? You know, let's say there's one queen, let's go with two and the fold-out suits two. You know, that it's limited to the occupancy of the unit
So
versus two in a room.
do we have to have it even listed as how many adults? Can we just define what it is without listing the adults?
So one thing to keep in mind, and again, the context in terms of where these definitions came from, your code today says a tourist home is allowed. It does not define or provide a short-term rental. It says a tourist home. Code also allows bed and breakfast in and house with no definition. That's your current code. Allows bed and breakfast in and house undefined. So in coming forward with this ordinance, the planning commission looked at it and said, well, wait a minute, we've got to put this definition someplace. So we're going to eliminate tourist home. So the tourist home goes away, and in its place is this short-term rental. We're also going to correct the confusion where bed and breakfast in and house is currently not defined by providing a definition. And that these are the definitions that came out of that process. Breakfast is misspelled, I've got that fixed. And so these are the definitions that came out of that process. The thing to keep in mind when you are trying to define something is also try to view it from the enforcement standpoint. And so if you remove the word, for example, normally, and you say a bed and breakfast is where no family or guest stays more than 7 nights. Well, what if you have a bed and breakfast, which we know what a bed and breakfast is, right? So you've got a bed and breakfast and they're staying 8 nights. Are they not allowed to stay 8 nights? And are you becoming so prescriptive that you force enforcement's hand on something that anybody would look at that and say, of course you should be able to say 8 nights. We know what a bed and breakfast is. So when you have those examples, just like Airbnb, Vrbo, and whatnot, they're provided as examples, as context of when the city's tasked with what is this? Does it quack like a duck? Does it walk like a duck? Is it a duck? There's some context in making that determination. So be very careful about being so prescriptive that you eliminate that discretion.
Well, do we need to have 7 nights? We just say the description of what the scenario is. What happens if they stay 18 nights? Well, normally, does that mean you can go up to 18?
And
It's less
again,
than 31.
and again, it's the question and the North Star in developing these definitions. And just, by the way, this isn't my definition. This is no, what's the word? I have no pride of authorship. I'm just, the rationale when you're reviewing these definitions is to keep in mind that you want to provide enough context and detail that you can understand what it is and differentiate it without being so prescriptive. So can you remove 7? You can remove 7 nights, but you're going to then remove some of the context. And that's what you're balancing.
And to me, the word normally gives some wiggle room there.
Right.
It eliminates the problem if somebody stays 8 nights or 10 nights or even 15 nights. It's
But
just,
is 15 nights in it?
no, but by saying normally, we're not prohibiting longer stays.
So what happens when it hits 29 days? Normally, it's like, oh, that's fine. I'm not trying to be difficult, but normally it's such a
But
not
on
controlled
average,
word.
is the entire population that's staying there staying 29? Or are they staying closer to 7?
I don't agree that we should have the word normally in there. I'm not sure if we even need the 7, and I'm having issues having 2 adults.
So just a couple of things to go back on, and I wanted to kind of go back on the definition. Suzanne, you said the difference about short-term rentals and bed and breakfast. Certainly, we shouldn't assume that it has anything to do with cooking facilities, because there's plenty of short-term rentals where you're only renting a bedroom from somebody. So I don't think it has anything to do with cooking facilities. I understand where Andrew's going, and when I went through the ordinance again today, I made some notes about the 2 adults, because there's many Airbnbs, VRBOs that they all tell you how many facilities are available there for people to sleep in. They show you the beds, the number of bedrooms, the whole 9 yards. And at least the ones I've been in, have been very strict about occupancy. So when we get to the definition of breakfast, I look at it and I say, all right, well, I understand the context for normally 7 days. But I also say, so what? Like, if it's 15, do we want to regulate that? If it's 35, do we want to regulate that? It's still an owner occupied establishment. If that owner wants to rent to somebody for 60 days, it doesn't bother me as long as they're not breaking the law anywhere else and are complying. I don't think the 7 days or the guest, number of guests in a room add anything to the context. I think, the definition here should be an owner occupied and operated establishment that provides sleeping accommodations in 10 or less designated guest rooms for rent to guests and where no cooking facilities are provided. I don't know why we would want to regulate any of that other stuff.
And the only reason for that is because what you just described is also so under fair housing laws, I can, in my single family home, rent to another person. And it's not a bed and breakfast. It's not what we would think is a bed and breakfast, right? And so, yes, do I have that right? You do have that right. You have that current right under current regulations, housing rules. So you can do that, but that's not a bed and breakfast. So I think the purpose of the normally stays more than where no family or guest normally stays more than 7 nights is to indicate that this is intended to be a temporary arrangement. Unlike I have a roommate situation. I think that's what that 7 nights differentiates between. The 2 adults, I do think that's a good point. I think that at the end of the day, occupancy is going to govern. So I don't know why we need to specify that. Will of council be the will of council, but I think that's fair. But the 7 nights, absent the 7 nights, you've described a roommate.
Okay, so could we include for rents to guests on a temporary basis? And then even if we say 31 and we had it the same as a short term, does it change it? I mean, do we want to regulate people over 7 days?
Well, this wouldn't, because it just says normally, but it doesn't set a limit.
I don't know what normally means either. We're gonna ask them for their average of stays all year. You know what I mean? I do agree that there are some issues with that, but if it is or isn't, it doesn't really bother me if it isn't. Is what I'm saying. I mean, I think it would be hard to regulate and hard for us to go in and prove any of it.
Right.
Who said end it where it said for rent to guests? Who said that? Was that you, Joe?
Joe.
Yeah.
That's what's in here now.
Yeah, no, I mean, if you just ended it, if you took
Oh.
out, I'm looking at.
For rent to guests and where no separate cooking facilities are provided, but we could say for rent to guests on a temporary basis. And we could even say not to exceed 31 days.
But again, then you're gonna have to be regulating that. You're gonna have to be, are we gonna have a room police?
Well, this brings up the question of whether or not do we need to differentiate everything then? Or
Well,
continue with.
And I'd
the
like to
rentals how they are.
go back to the occupancy. I don't know, does fire code prescribe the number of people per room based on square footage or number of beds or, because we talked about that as a safety issue.
Well, if single family dwellings, it isn't the fire code, it's the property maintenance code. So, but it is all based on square footage of bedrooms, depending on how big the bedroom is. You can have 1 occupant on the 70 square feet, you add another 70, you can additional occupants. So it's all square footage. It has nothing to do with beds, bathrooms, anything. And then it gives you the ability to have additional occupants in large living rooms and open spaces. So, Yeah.
If, gentlemen, I'm sorry, but if you would like to have a conversation, would you mind taking it to the lobby? It's a bit distracting.
I'm sorry for that.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, if there's another section where we get into all the safety regulations and we'll get into whether or not we just want to say must follow the existing building code instead of enumerating them. And if we did that, Mr. Hoffman, how would that affect this? If we just said referred to the standard building code, then do we need to enumerate this other thing?
You don't need, so 2 things, the building code is going to apply anyway. So
Right.
you don't need to refer to it for it to apply, it's going to apply. And again, in the definition, you're not setting this is saying that for a bed and breakfast, there would be a regulation on the 2 adults. That's correct. If you removed that, then it would default to what the standard would be in the building. I think Antonina asked the question of why do you even need the definition? Which is a question. So I think what we want to do is we want to verify that there are no other regulations on bed and breakfast aside from parking. I'm not sure I know what the specific bed and regulation would be for a bed and breakfast. But that is an option as well. You could just say, we aren't going to, thinking out loud, we aren't going to regulate it, but then it still has a question of if you don't define it, and I come forward in the town and I want to have a bed and breakfast, is it a permitted use? So if you removed it from the code, because you say we don't want to define it, then if I have one and want to operate one, well, now I'm no longer a permitted use. So that's where these things matter.
And this goes back to the history of this whole issue, that we have the definition for tourist home, we have a requirement for rentals, but we don't differentiate it. And so that's where we need to decide, do we want to continue differentiating it, do we not? And that's where Max proposed these 3 different definitions, because they were not defined by type.
I do agree. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
One thing we may want to consider is, where we are going to be permitting these uses. So, the way the ordinance is written is bed and breakfast would be permitted in the HR and the HC districts. And one could have a straight up commercial use in a historic commercial district, and we wouldn't typically care about how long one would stay there. So one possible solution, if you will, would be to put more restrictive conditions on bed and breakfasts in the historic residential district, so as to prevent and run around other regulations that could possibly cause a problem. Because limiting something to 7 days or whatever in a historic commercial district may be out of place with other uses that are allowed by right in the historic commercial district.
Just to clarify, I mean, so this isn't changing where bed and breakfasts are permitted. So this is wherever they are permitted today is where they would continue. I think downtown Gateway, and I haven't looked at all of them, but
Yeah, just the DG and where tourist homes are permitted.
But I thought we also said they could be anywhere in the city now.
it's short-term rentals.
Oh, okay.
So, and that's the challenge, right? Because the tourists, and that's why I'm broken record on this, but I think it's important context. So tourist home used to be permitted in those districts. And tourist home was removed in lieu of short-term rental, and short-term rental was expanded to be in any district where there's a residential unit in existence. Bed and breakfast is not being expanded. Bed and breakfast is wherever it is allowed today, it is continuing to be allowed. The challenge is right now it's allowed without a definition. It's bed and breakfast is a bed and breakfast. And then you look to Merriam-Webster and that's what you do, what you look to in order, if I come forward and I want a bed and breakfast, which is permitted in the DG zone, then I can say I'm a bed and breakfast because here's Merriam-Webster's and here's my definition. This adds a definition. Without the definition, you're back to Merriam-Webster land and you're back to trying to figure out what that means. Same issue with an inn. And my understanding of the inn is your permitted uses today say bed and breakfast house, bed and breakfast inn. And so you're gonna have a bed and breakfast and you're gonna have an inn. And but it's not expanding where an inn can be. It's not changing anything like that, similar to the bed and breakfast.
Could we?
I was just gonna say, I was having a hard time with the distinction between bed and breakfast and inn. It's more than 5, but less than 10. So if you have a bed and breakfast that has 7, which is less than 10, without cooking facilities, they could call it the Newcastle Inn instead of the Newcastle B&B.
Non-owner occupied.
Okay, well, that was another question I had. What does that mean? Does that mean the owner of the building or the owner of the business? And what if it's owned by an LLC who has to live there?
Yeah, so that would be I mean, on all of these things, these are all enforcement questions that inevitably come up. But at the end of the day, we would look to the intent. And the intent here would be that you have a person who is living there as whether they are a member of the LLC or the individual or whatnot, that the owner representative is living on premises.
So should we change, what if, I mean, I can't imagine anybody doing that here because they're not gonna make enough money. But I've stayed in a B&B where there was a resident manager who was not the owner. And would that count?
That would be one of those gray areas.
I mean, like I said, that was in a heavily tourist area, where there was high demand, and so the owners of the building, the property could afford to do it that way. Here, unless something changes dramatically, people aren't making enough money to do that. But nonetheless, I think we have to look at the issue. I mean, we have one, well, I won't go there because that's a short-term rental, but
For one clarification, this kind of building off of the I think the distinction in the inn scenario is that is because you have an existing inn.
right.
And the purpose is, and I think the difference is that bed and breakfast would be subject to a parking requirement. The inn is not. And so if you eliminated the definition of inn, now you make that business non-conforming. And I think that was the issue on why there's the
But
definition.
let's say somebody there's a few large Victorian houses in town, and they're gonna have 7 bedrooms to rent. That puts them in both categories of bed and breakfast and terry house and inn, because they're under 10 but more than 5, and they don't have separate cooking facilities. So if they call themselves an inn, then they don't have to meet the parking requirements.
It's true. But a non-owner occupied, that's
But
cool.
would we,
Not owner occupied.
but we would not want that.
What, what?
Well, so I know we've been in today and they're parking pretty much on Delaware Street, but if another inn opens, wouldn't you want them to have parking?
Well, that's another whole issue, the parking thing, because I mean,
And this is just to get back to the task at hand that you charged the planning commission. The issue was to look at short-term rentals, and Airbnbs and all that. That's why there's so much detail on what is now required for short-term rentals and everything.
Understood. And
So
I'm
if
not
we
in
want you to-
agreement with that stuff because we don't have it for the other items.
That's fine, but if you want to do that, then we have to change the scope and continue exploring options.
But if you're setting us up for a situation that you define out the wazoo of everything that they need to do for bed and breakfast and exclude the other areas, you're gonna set us up for
Short-term
lawsuits.
rentals.
Yeah, you have,
short-term rentals are the ones with the extensive sets of, that goes on for like 3
Bed and
days.
breakfast has the part.
yeah, but it's not consistent.
Here's one approach that you could take, and it's the will of council. I think these definitions were the product of trying to clean up the code. Because when they were going through this effort, they realized, hey, these are some undefined terms and you have some hanging parking requirements. And while we're in here doing it, let's clean it up. I think that's where it came from. But if council is not comfortable with that, then we don't have to change the definitions. You can just create a definition of short-term rental and you can just focus on the short-term rentals. But you're then gonna leave hanging the bed and breakfast and the
Right.
definition and the parking, so.
Yeah, I mean, the owner occupied thing for bed and breakfast. I've stayed in many bed and breakfasts in the States and abroad, and they're not all owner occupied. Otherwise, they're typical bed and breakfast. You have a bedroom, you have your breakfast down in a common room in the morning, and, that's it. And they're, you tell them what time you're gonna check in, someone meets you, or they give you, in one case, they gave us code for a punch code, the keypad And that's how we got in, and we didn't see anyone for,
Right.
till the next day. So why are we specifying owner occupied for bed and breakfast?
That was a
Cause that's what the.
planning commission desire, I believe.
Well, some people's at least, right?
Yeah.
My sense in some of this is to make sure nobody else can open another one.
That's what I kind of figured. They're trying to define it so that nobody else can do it. And is that what we want to do? Do we want to be in the business of telling people what they may do with their property when we have, as someone pointed out, no evidence that that causes a problem or has caused a problem in this community?
And if you're going to later on in this, limit the number you can have in the HR,
Right.
you know.
So-
So,
That wouldn't apply to the bed and breakfast.
That's just short-term
That's just the short-term rental,
Short-term rental.
but again, what we can do, and again, if it's the will of council, we can remove those definitions and remove those issues and let it be as it is today. And you can either take it up at a future date, or you can say it's not a problem today, and so we're gonna see, but that's,
Well, I guess I was seeing somewhere in between there I mean, tourist home is kind of an outdated term, no,
that's going away, that's right.
right, right. And I think it says up to 5. And maybe we want to have it conflate bed and breakfast and short-term rental for the smaller ones and keep in for the larger one. I don't know. I can see several ways to go with that. I don't see any rationale other than some people's belief that an owner occupied, the owner would keep them under control and they wouldn't have wild parties but nobody in any of our short-term rentals has had wild parties.
Yeah.
We're not the kind of community that attracts wild parties. Our bars close at 10 o'clock. This is not the type of community where people are gonna come to have a bachelor party or a gang of college kids come and rent a place for a week. That's stuff that happens at a beach community or another type of resort community. The people who come here are just in history. They tend to be older. They tend to be pretty sedate. And therefore, I don't see all this concern about what might happen because it has never happened. And how can we tell people what they can do with their property and restrict what they can do with their property strictly on the base of an unfounded or an undocumented fear of some people?
Well, I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I certainly think that there's a big difference between a short-term rental and a bed and breakfast. A huge difference for me. I mean, I look at a short-term rental, it's like we're talking about an Airbnb, you rent somebody's house, even a portion of their house. Whereas in a bed and breakfast, you may have somebody that's living there and have 8 guests there too, with 8 cars and eight different issues. And I think that's a lot different than a short-term rental, just in my opinion.
Well, I see the difference because the short-term rental has the cooking facilities and people tend to rent the whole thing and stay there for however long they stayed there. And I can see that point. In terms of the parking, if we make it impossible or very difficult for people to use their properties as short-term rentals for B&Bs, they may put them into long-term rent. And short-term rentals, if I go, I mean, my husband and I each have a car, so there's 2 cars parked in front of our house. If we go somewhere and drive, we take 1 car. So that's 1 car. So these rental places that have guests probably are only gonna have 1 car. Most of them are only rented 50% of the time, which means you have fewer demands on parking than if they say, well, if they're not gonna let us do short-term rentals, we'll just do a long-term rental. And then what if you rent a whole house to a couple with a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old? You're looking at potentially 4 cars for that unit, and we would have no restriction on that. It would clog up the available parking spaces more than if that house was an Airbnb that was rented 50% of the time, most of the time, only 1 car.
I don't disagree with you on any of that either. I still think a bed and breakfast is a lot different than an Airbnb.
So,
It's a huge difference.
so I think that, like, using the code, you can legislate or dissuade certain types of activity. we all have been to places that are dry towns, or towns that don't have any fast food restaurants, or towns that don't have any adult clubs. So they do that very successfully. The short-term rental issue did previously come up in the vernacular of the city of Newcastle a couple councils ago. Mr. Demandi brought forward a request to make it a special exception. And that just went to the planning commission and just kind of died there. Along that vein, in respect to bed and breakfast or inn, if we don't want to say touch it now, we could allow for a special exception to where, you know, someone, I know Councilperson Zelt said you don't necessarily want to just allow for it, but maybe there might be a certain scenario where it does make sense. But you don't go turn the faucet full on.
Isn't in there just for the Terry House?
Think so.
That's my
Yes,
understanding.
yes.
Oh,
I mean, it's been there for over 25 years.
oh, so, yeah.
To the best of my knowledge, there've never been any problems with noise or loud parties or anything at the Terry House. I've lived in town for most of the time they've been in business.
So Airbnb, as we know, is a platform, and a lot of people don't like the usage of the word Airbnb. What else do you call it?
Short-term rental.
Short-term rental.
I mean, that's what the common vernacular is short-term renter.
So if I can make a suggestion, to kind of frame the options as I'm hearing them. On the inn is a separate definition for the Terry House, and it's a separate definition so that the Terry House doesn't require parking. So you could eliminate that definition and merge it into a bed and breakfast where it can be an owner or non-owner occupied. Add the definition, remove the with 2 or more or no more than 2 adults, and have the normally 7 nights. And so you merge those in. The effect of that would then be that the Terry House is non-conforming on parking.
Right.
And they're non-conforming use. Doesn't mean they have to close, but they would then be non-conforming. So that's a way to clean up the definition, Council President's point, but the effect is they're gonna be non-conforming use.
Right.
Can't we just put in a thing saying they're fine?
You cannot.
Can you grandfather people in?
That is
Yeah.
grandfather.
Oh,
As a non-conforming use, they would not be permitted to expand,
Correct.
And as soon as it just goes away for 6 months, it's gone,
which is
which is not what you want to do either.
Say that last thing, Mr. Day.
If the use was extinguished for 6 months, like they were selling the building or whatever, it just closed for 6 months. Once it's gone for 6
oh,
months.
they
the-
lose their.
They
lose their
lose their non-conforming
okay.
status.
So if they had to do
Renovations or something.
major renovations and it had to be closed for 6 months, they could lose their grandfathering status.
So the alternative approach, if you wanted to, which is that's where the planning commission landed, as I understand it. The alternative approach is to have a separate definition, but then you have to have some distinctions. And here the distinction is owner occupied, non-owner occupied. That does mean that if in the future somebody comes in, they say, I want to be a non-owner occupied that meets that definition, I want to be an inn, they can be an inn. They would be permitted in the same way.
But they have to have at least 5 rooms. If
Correct.
it's a smaller facility and then you have 3 rooms, then they can't
That's
be an inn by this definition.
And so I think that's where the planning commission landed on this. I was not in there, but that is the line, and that's where they landed. But again, you can see those are your options. You can blend them together, and that's the effect. You can keep it the way it is, and that's the effect. And it's what is the will of council?
So is most of this over parking? Because the reason I ask that, 'cause I still have issues why we're requiring the parking. We have people who rent full-time years and,
Are you talking about for the bed and breakfast or a short-term rental?
well, either parking situation.
It's required.
It would be nice to get that far.
I understand that, but it sounds like some of this stuff is based upon what that is, if we need parking. That seems to be the biggest issue.
Yeah, bed and breakfast is required to have one off
mean,
street for each
If
unit.
I change my house into a rental, am I required to have so many parking spaces?
Not longer.
No. So do we need to have that for these other scenarios?
If we eliminated the off-street parking requirements, which is a later part of this ordinance, then the definitions as they're written could kind of stand and preserve the Terry House. And if somebody else wanted to open another place and call it an inn, well, they wouldn't have to do that because there's no, the only difference is that they don't have to have parking if they're an inn by the current.
And you would be subject to, I mean, you would still have to be a permitted use under whatever the zoning designation is, and so the definition matters in terms of your zoning and where you can be. But that is correct, the off-street parking is a piece that would go away.
Well, maybe we should move on then, and, because if we decide we want to take out the parking, then that kind of eliminates the problems with having these three separate definitions.
And I think that makes sense. The only thing, just to clarify, my understanding from council is you want us to remove the with no more than 2 adults in the same guest room.
I do.
I do,
I do.
yeah,
Mike, I do have a
but I'm
question.
still
about-
having issues with normally staying more than 7 nights as well.
What would you substitute instead of the word normally?
I like on a temporary basis. but
Yeah,
that's just me.
temporary basis is good.
Mike, if, under the definition of inn, if I opened something and I provided sleeping accommodations for less than 5, what am I then? Am I just a single family dwelling?
So this is, you are a non-owner occupied, so you have a house, you have a rental. Sleeping accommodations and less, yeah, it's just a rental.
Okay. Okay, that's what I thought. Wanted to be sure.
So for the bed and breakfast, are we just hoping to get rid of the 2 adults, and also are we saying temporarily with less than 31 days? Think you mentioned that, Joe?
I did, I just threw the number in there, but I actually think temporary basis is actually sufficient, but that's just my opinion.
The temporary still kind of falls in a normal scenario? Sorry. So what does temporary mean?
Not permanent?
I think at some point you gotta use recognizable definitions, and obviously you can't have a long-term lease if you're a temporary. You're not gonna have somebody with a, you know what I mean, a long-term lease,
I
but
mean, is there,
you know.
I think I've heard a reference to something called the reasonable person standard. And so what would a reasonable person consider to be normally, or what would a reasonable person consider to be temporary?
So it's a little bit different, but it does go back to what the intent is, and it, you know, what is intended to be temporary, and the context matters. And so again, that's your context clue. You would look at bed and breakfast, you would look at how it's defined, you would look at what Merriam-Webster says, you would look at how it's used, and you would gauge the context. I don't have an objection to saying on a temporary basis if that's the will of council. I do think some context is important though, as nebulous as it may be.
And I'm not opposed to putting a number in, but frankly, from a regulatory side, I don't care if it's 6 months. I mean, it's a bed and breakfast. I mean, it's hard to imagine somebody's gonna stay there that long, but I could also see the other side of it where, you know, I might have came to town to take care of a loved one and I'm staying there and then it gets worse and worse and I end up staying there long term. I can see both sides of that. So, and again, like, who's going to complain that I stayed in the bed and breakfast for 6 months? Like, who's the victim of you know what I mean?
Right. And one of the complaints of
Yeah, it's
people
just-
that we've heard from the community is, well, we don't want all these strangers coming back and forth and walking down the streets and
Yeah.
looking in our windows. And it's like, well, if the same people are there for 6 months, then it's a more
Unbelievable, you
stable.
guys are destroying our city.
All right, fine.
Just go.
I'll leave too. I think that you guys are focused on the wrong thing. I think the community's view was it's a residential area and they want to keep it residential for residents, not for bed and breakfast, not for these other things. And that's why I think all this was enacted. That's
Well-
where I think the parking came in and everything else is the residents want residents in a resident
Well-
neighborhood.
That gets into the number, which is when we get into the 2.5%. we
I
probably-
appreciate your hard work, though. I know this is very difficult. Thanks.
Yeah.
One thing leads to another. It's like when you're making a repair on an old house and you pull off the siding and and you find out there's something else underneath, it's gonna cost you more money, you know?
Can I just paraphrase a little bit what Leo said, and that's that we all know that if we're permanent residents in town and we have 2 cars, that's fine. But if we become a B and B, use the definition that's there, still live there, then you could have additional parking situations. I think that's kind of what this.
And you didn't have another occupancy requirement, it wouldn't necessarily be the extra cars.
I don't know,
We-
I think.
I don't really have an issue with the air, with the bed and breakfast parking requirements. I mean, I find it hard to believe that somebody's gonna come in and open a lot of bed and breakfast anyway. But, I mean, I don't necessarily, that's what I was saying. So if you have, 10 guest rooms, even if you're only at 40% occupancy, it is 4 more cars. So I kind of understand for that. And anybody taking on like a commercial venture as a bed and breakfast want to address parking because they want their clients to be happy and to be parking close. So I don't necessarily have an issue with the parking standards for bed and breakfast. I certainly have a issue with the parking standards for the short-term rentals because I do think that the parking for those are less than we normally see.
And I will say it's not uncommon for there to be parking standards for commercial uses. I mean, there's gonna be parking standards for residential use. There are parking standards.
Mhm.
And so those are not uncommon.
These sections are not totally freestanding in that they all relate.
Correct.
The definition about parking and the number of units per zone, all those things affect the impact of these definitions.
Correct, but I also think that the challenge, and it's the nature of doing a comprehensive ordinance of this type. Just because something isn't listed here doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So your code does regulate parking for a host of uses. It regulates parking for residential. You have off-street parking standards elsewhere in the code. This doesn't mean that it's only bed and breakfast getting you all notice, but that's the thing to keep in mind. So it's not unheard of for there to be a parking standard.
And the tourist home already required all this too. We're just
Correct.
striking the word, we're just striking the word tourist home and adding bread and breakfast and you go through it.
But I don't think tourist home required parking.
It did,
Oh.
and in fact, bed and
Yeah,
breakfast.
it's all right
does.
here in the ordinance. You know what I mean? Whatever is stricken is what was there.
One
Added it
space.
a lot.
That's right.
Oh.
So your current code for bed and breakfast requires 2 spaces plus 1 per guest or rental. And this is revising that to be 1 space for each guest room or suite. And then that matches what the definition of tourist home or the parking standard for tourist home used to be.
Okay, because I don't think we have any bed and breakfast in town as defined by this ordinance.
Well, but
Nothing
the code currently allows it, and it's subject to the current standard. I don't know what exists, that doesn't exist.
No, we don't.
We have some short-term rentals, we have 1 in, and that's it.
Yes.
Are you calling the Terry House an inn?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's more than 5.
But again, I'll say, if somebody wanted to come in and do a bed and breakfast, I would expect them to have parking. I mean, especially if you're talking about 10 units. I mean, and I think anybody coming in to do that would expect that they would have to have some parking for their guests. I don't think that's a stretch. I don't really think it's gonna happen, but
Yeah, I
So-
don't, that is, even if you wanted to split your house up with, there's no one likes that idea anyways. Where are you gonna have that additional parking? Cause that's gonna be your sticking point right there. Because take a large house on West Fourth or on the Strand, where's your parking gonna be for one of those houses that say has 4 or 5 rooms? Or you go back to, Joe may remember, Suzanne definitely will, the number 2, the Strand.
Where the Henrys live was
Yeah,
a
where the
B&B.
Henry's was a B&B and there's 4 rooms and 4 bathrooms. Where's the parking for 4 rooms and 4 rooms there? There isn't. The point being, there isn't, people could park up around the
Circle by the wharf.
circle by the wharf, but again, if they wanted to divide that back up into an Airbnb, they're gonna have to be compliant to the code for parking, and is that something they wanna deal with?
I don't think that's what it's saying at all, though. I think you're conflating Airbnb and short-term rental with a bed and breakfast.
thought
I
they
don't
do
believe there
basically
should be
have-
any parking restrictions for the short-term rentals, right? But I do believe
But we're
it's for-
talking about new, old buildings. If they're not a bed and breakfast, they're four apartments or five apartments, right? Each of which could have two cars attached to it. So the fact that they're rented out for short-term rentals does not increase the possible numbers of cars because we're not building new buildings, basically. We're having a different use of it. So the existing use of it, multiple apartments, would also have more cars.
I'm not arguing about the parking with the short-term rentals. I
No,
think
no,
that's.
but I mean, even a large, like the Cherry House would be turned into four apartments, right, at least?
But again, if it were converted to an apartment use, then it's gonna be subject to their off-street parking standards on the residential use. And I think that the thing to keep in mind in all this also comes back to what Brian said, which is you also have a mechanism in your code, which are the variances from the Board of Adjustment. So if you have a building and you want to come in and you say, I can't meet the parking standard, and that's an exceptional practical difficulty for me, you have that, that's why the Board of Adjustment exists. That's the purpose for that. So the question for council is from a policy standpoint, what is the correct approach in setting the policy? And for context, you have offsite, it's, I would say it is, and Chris, you can back me up on this. I think it is rare not to have a minimum off-street parking or requirement associated with the use. So when you're defining a use, having an off-street parking requirement makes sense. So I think my recommendation would be, I think that where this ordinance lands on the parking requirement relative to bed and breakfast is consistent with what your current off-street parking requirement is. It cleans it up between some sections. That's what this does. So having an off-street parking requirement for bed and breakfast makes sense. And the off-street parking requirement you see here is consistent with what you have and makes sense in that regard. Your definition piece makes sense when you look at it through the lens of the Terry House being non-conforming and trying to distinguish that and walking that line. So you can see how this evolved. The ultimate question becomes, are you comfortable with that in order to then move forward with the short-term rental, which is the main impetus of this? Or do you not want to touch that? And then you revert to what it is today so that you can move forward to the short-term rental. I think that's the way to look at this.
Put in potentially number of how many we can have for short-term rentals in each of the different zones. Couldn't we also do that for the number of inns and make it one?
No, that you can't, no,
Why not?
because it can't be arbitrary. So even when we were talking about, I understand the past city council meeting or the question of, let's just have X number of short-term rentals in the city. We would recommend against that. If you're gonna have a number per district, that's one thing. But when you're just saying X number per city without taking into account the districts, that's where you're starting to get into that arbitrary. So then just to say, we're only gonna allow one, it's the one we have,
Or a variance to that is, for district or issuing licenses, releasing them at certain given times, right? So for example, they do it with like marijuana and other things, so we're gonna release 5 licenses this year, 10 licenses the next year, as an example.
I think the only difference, or one of the key differences is you're talking about permitted uses. And so your permitted uses should be evaluated based on the districts. And I think that's where this comes down to.
Okay, I'd like, if we're gonna, since we're going into that, all right, currently we're limiting them in all the districts, the residential and the commercial. Now, we've heard from many people who've commented, bed and breakfast and short-term rentals belong in the commercial district, they don't belong in the residential district. But yet, when we proposed the 2.5% for everything per zone, as I think we went over these numbers before, the historic residential district has 535 units. Parcels at 2.5%, that's 13, which seems like a lot. Short-term rentals. So could we say that the percent limit applies only to the 4 residential zones, not to the commercial or the DG zone? But they could be unlimited.
I agree with that.
Yes.
And so if we did that, then we could lower the percentage to have fewer in the residential zones and unlimited in the commercials.
But your commercial is pretty small.
Yeah, we
anyway.
brought that up the other day.
Yeah, our historic commercial district is the smallest of these zones. It only has 31 parcels.
The one caveat is wherever that percentage falls, you want to make sure that there is some minimum amount. So I think right now it says at least
Minimum of
2 or.
Do you have to use a percentage? Can't you use a fixed?
No, what Lisa told us last month after the council meeting, that to use a fixed number is inequitable because some zones have more parcels than other parcels. So if you use a percentage, then it's equitable because it's based on the number of parcels. So I did some math. For example, all right, at 2.5%, the R1 district could have 20. The R2 could have 10, the R3 could have 15, and the historic residential could have 13. If you cut back to 1.5%, that would be 12 in R1, 6 in R2, 9 in R3, and 8 in historic residential. Or if you went back to 1%, it would be 8 in R1, 4 in R2, 6 in R3, and 5 in historic residential. So
Did you go further, like 0.5?
no,
I did I did 3/4%.
okay,
But I rounded my numbers up. But in 3/4%, you're at 7 in R1, 4 in R2, 5 in R3, and 5 in the HR.
okay, well,
And
that's,
really between 3/4% and 1% is probably where I think we should be.
yeah, so,
But I do agree with exempting the other 4 districts, HC, RC, DG, and SC.
You can do that.
Because right now you have 3 in the HR.
right, and the limit would be,
5.
5. Well, yeah, this would make it 5 if we went with 1%.
Well, I think when we do the math, though, we would round up
Well, I
automatically.
think I did the rounding based on if it was 0.5 or more, I rounded up. If it was less, I rounded down.
Mhm.
But I guess we'd have to specify that, right? How we do the
You
math.
typically round up, but yes.
No, so if it's 1.2, it still gets rounded up to 3 to 2.
Yeah, to the next poll. Yep.
Okay,
So
well,
it would still leave us at 9, 5, 6, and 6. And I think they seem like they're reasonable
Yeah.
numbers, and it's fair amongst all the districts.
and we have 3 currently in HR. And so that would allow for 2 more to come in.
3 more.
So 1% for the other districts is what.
What brought the number to 5 in the HR?
1% is 5 by my math.
My math is 3/4% is 5.
And
But
1%.
because we rounded up, 1% actually goes to 6.
Oh, okay.
Then go to, I think you should stick with 5 in the historic residential, which would be the 3/4. I know that's kind of a weird number, but it just seems more
I
comfortable.
mean, you're only talking about 1.
I know, but.
And
what-
frankly, nobody's
issue-
rushing to do this.
No, you're right, and
If
absolutely.
anybody was, they could have did it while we were, you know what I mean, while we were going through this process.
Right, but again, going back to even what they said, this whole thing came about because one, well, there's 3, they didn't know about the other 2 in the historic residential area. So that's where that
Yeah.
all started, and.
But I look at it and could the city absorb another one on West Third and then one on West Fifth and maybe one on East Fifth? Yeah, I mean, it was not even a blip on the radar.
It doesn't mean they'd all be concentrated
Yeah.
around.
No,
the river.
no, I know, but then those ones have the parking restriction, is that correct?
We haven't got there yet.
Well,
Okay,
yeah, as proposed, yes, they would have a parking restriction.
Which would be difficult because.
It would limit which houses could do that.
Yeah.
And so if somebody wanted to do and they couldn't because of the parking, then they're more likely to make it a long-term rental where no parking is.
I'll draft it for one. Again, you're not voting tonight. This is, we'll revise the ordinance and then you'll have it at a future meeting.
But it just makes sense to me to not have a restriction on the commercial districts.
I was looking at, the minutes from September the tenth and, then I'm going back to the last council meeting we had some discussion. At the special meeting, I made a recommendation about occupancy rates, to be included and reported to the city. As of January, this year, that is a requirement, by the state. The state says that, the data shall be at minimum include the accommodations, of the address of each rental unit, number of nights rented each for each unit, and the aggregate rents collected for each property. The state is getting it. I think we should be, since it's happening in our city, this is something that definitely, there's mixed feelings about. I think we, in order to have an understanding as to if this is something we want to increase from the 3.5, 0.75% or 1% on a going forward basis without having that data, we have no way of knowing. Additionally, last year it was brought up for council potential consideration in regards to the 3% tax. I think that is warranted. The state even does memorandums for understanding from other municipalities where they actually collect it. I've spoken with some of the proprietors who actually have these establishments within our city, and they said, hey, city wants to take it. It's paid by the person that stays there. So I know we're not there yet, but I do need, as a full disclosure, I do need to represent those things because I certainly will be looking to see some of those things. If that's not the will of council, it's not the will of council, but I will be bringing it forward.
Well, at this point, I think when we discussed this, we said that at the 3%, given the occupancy rate, I mean, we did the rough math because we didn't have exact numbers, but it would barely, if even, cover the cost of administration. Now, if going forward, there are more and the occupancy rate goes up, having that data might help us determine at what point we've reached that tipping point where it's cost effective for the city to have a lodging tax. Right now, it doesn't seem that it is because there's administrative costs. If the state is going to gather the data for us, we're not going to get all the money. They're going to keep some of it, just like they do with the traffic ticket for processing.
No, we can say an additional 3% city
Yeah,
tax.
But so
But-
a
and
couple,
then-
couple things to keep in mind. So we've got to keep to the agenda,
Yeah.
which is this topic. On that, I'm going to use my favorite Max Walton-ism, that dog won't hunt. I think the challenge is that requesting that data when you have a lodging tax or to support the lodging tax, that makes sense, but requesting the data on rentals and whatnot in this context, I think is problematic. And I would caution against that. I think you're gonna get the data in terms of the numbers, in terms of the ones that you have based on the licenses that are gonna be issued per the ordinance. But to take it a step further and ask for the rents and the rental information is, I think you would run into a challenge.
And that's already written in here. That was one of my questions too.
So I recognize the fact that we're somewhat behind the cart because the General Assembly doesn't meet until next year, et cetera. But like I said, I know they can, potentially give us the option to have the tax until next year, but regardless,
It's not on the agenda there, right?
well, we're talking about short-term rental.
Yeah, but and Brian's getting at what is the information that's required here? And that question did come up before. My recollection was to remove it for the reasons that we just talked about. That asking about rental information and that piece, which is unrelated to any of the regulatory components.
Right.
Is you don't have that correlation to
It's
justify.
unnecessarily intrusive into their private business. But,
But different if you had a tax.
right,
But when you have a
let me
tax,
ask you this, the state collects that data because the state does have a
Correct.
lodging tax. Can we get that at least aggregate data from the state for the total number in the city of Newcastle, not isolated by unit or B and B A and in B and so on? So that would give us the data you're talking about without being intrusive and requesting it directly from the owner.
I think that's good.
So just getting back to this, I know we were going through this one by one, was there, can we go make sure there was no issues with the licensing or the local contract section? Or the interior placard?
Well, I think we have one, I think in section A, the licensing, that's where we ran into this says no more than 2 persons per bedroom, and the other
Hmm.
section said adults.
You're
And
right.
we had an amendment to change persons, in this case to adults, to allow for a couple and their child but that would not deal with the issue of a disabled adult child being with them, but at least it would deal with minor children. So I think we already had amendment 1, I think it was, or. Yes, amendment, the one I labeled 3, to change no more than 2 adults to no more, to change that section A from 2 persons per bedroom to 2 adults per bedroom.
Yeah.
Which makes it consistent with the definition.
Why do we have to
I don't
have
know if
that?
we're taking
Why
that
wouldn't
out.
we just say a short-term rental license shall be for 2 years and shall indicate the maximum occupancy of the dwelling?
Yeah.
And then we don't have to worry about 2 persons or 2
Yeah.
adults or
They've
anything.
already figured out the other
That's good.
definition.
Because, I mean, we, on a regular basis, regulatory agencies tell you what the maximum occupancy of a dwelling is.
Right, based on fire codes. and
Exactly,
so forth.
yep.
So shall indicate this, so B for 2, so we would put a period after indicate the maximum occupancy and
Period, correct.
in period and eliminate
Maximum occupancy of the dwelling.
period.
Yep.
Okay,
That would have to be
Oh.
consistent with your building code anyway.
Right, exactly.
So this is just for the short term, right?
yeah.
Correct.
So bed and breakfast wouldn't have to do this.
Correct. But again, and I understand what you're saying, and this is my broken record piece. I understand what you're saying, but if there is currently no regulation of that type for bed and breakfast, that is the current state of the law. And the task here for the planning commission was to address regulations for short-term
I
rentals only.
understand that, but you're putting in all this stuff that they need to do that other scenarios should be doing as well.
But you already talked about taking it out of the definition for bed and breakfast anyway, so it doesn't matter.
We talked about taking out the 2 per 2 adult limit.
But
I'm
about
talking
regulation.
concept overall. You're putting in all these requirements for short term, but nothing for bed or breakfast, nothing for inn. Shouldn't this stuff just be
Well, I think.
all this stuff that you should be putting in place to all this stuff? Well, is there a reason like some of this stuff wouldn't be on just a form to get a
The only thing I'll-
rental
I
agreement?
don't think that's what we asked of the planning commission.
No, but I
Well,
will
you
tell
gotta be
you,
consistent.
I will tell you, fire codes, there is some consistency, we're just not seeing it here. The fire code requires annual inspections for a bunch of different type of occupancies. But the occupancies that we're dealing with here, the short-term rentals, are typically single-family dwellings. And they're not subject to inspections of the fire code. The fire marshal does not come in single-family dwellings. They don't have regulatory authority there. That's where the building code, property maintenance code, and everything else comes in. But in like a normal bed and breakfast, the fire marshal does do regular inspections in a bed and breakfast or an apartment building or a hotel. Any of those type of occupancies, they already do inspections.
So some of this in the later sections where they enumerate, they have to have, the GFI and all that stuff, that's covered by the building code. I guess we'll get to that.
And that's great and all, but I don't know that.
What do you mean?
I mean, I know I'm on council, and all, but I don't know that those requirements are already in place for these other scenarios.
Yeah.
So should that be defined, noting that this is covered here? I'm confused that we're asking for all this stuff for the short term and not knowing that there's all these other things that need to be done because this is covered elsewhere. I don't know it's covered elsewhere.
Well, and I think that my recommendation would be to not add anything because it is covered by these codes. And I think the example that I would give is in this ordinance, we mentioned nothing about a restaurant.
Right.
And so, but there are rules and regulations on restaurants. And so the purpose of this ordinance is not regulating restaurants. That doesn't mean there aren't those regulations. It doesn't mean that there isn't a baseline It just means that the purpose here was to address this issue. I think the distinction here on between this and the bed and breakfast, I think is a good one. Joe's spot on. You typically see these in residential dwellings, which are, you know, where you want these life safety regulations to apply. They're not necessarily going to be captured, but that doesn't mean that those life safety regulations don't exist for the other uses. They do. It's just not the subject of this ordinance.
Because I think, I mean, if we say that to get their license, they have to have an inspection. And so the inspector is gonna make sure that they meet all those life safety
But
requirements.
wouldn't short term have to do that as well?
Yes,
So,
that's why I don't think when we get into D, I don't think we need to enumerate all this stuff. I was gonna ask Mike's opinion on that. That we just say, pass their life safety inspection or meet the building code or something, that we don't need to enumerate all this other stuff that they put in section D.
So what I would say on that is if it's duplicative, then you meet it through your building code, right? And I think that it was, and this I did ask Max from our last workshop following that. I did ask Max the question in terms of that piece, and his point was simple, that the planning commission, Margot, tell me if Max is wrong.
Never.
Tell me if Max is wrong.
Never tell you Max is wrong.
The planning commission felt it was important to call those out specifically. So even though they're duplicative, it was important that everybody understand that we want to see these. And that from an enforcement standpoint, doesn't change anything. You can be duplicative. And that was the intent.
But if that's the intent for short-term rentals, then Andrew's point is, then why is it not also our intent for B and Bs?
It is though.
Even though we don't have
So-
one.
So with inns and bed and breakfast and stuff, we don't adopt all our codes. That's the Delaware Fire Prevention Regulations. And it requires all that stuff for again, assembly buildings, motels, hotels, apartment buildings. There's regular inspections for that type of thing. It's different with a short-term rental, again, because you're backing into a single-family home, and generally the state regulations stay out of your house. I mean. it's
Okay,
the way
now I
it is.
understand.
So
why
it is a little
it's
different with
necessary
that.
to spell it out for short-term rentals, but not
Yep.
for the other thing.
And what I'll tell you about the requirements, I don't agree with all the requirements in D, but the biggest problem and the biggest news articles you see about short-term rentals is not having working smoke detectors or carbon monoxide detectors and somebody dying in a fire.
Yeah.
It's a regular base, you see it regularly, and I think it's good that it's in there, in my own opinion, just because it's clear, this is what you gotta have. Like I said, I don't agree with all of them in D, but at least the smoke detectors and the carbon monoxide detectors, I think are reasonable. When we get to the fire extinguisher, I thought was reasonable. The receptacles, I think the wording is a little off. I think it should say each receptacle within 6 feet of a sink must be GFCI. I don't think it should say you have to have one within 6 feet of a sink. I think that's just
Like,
back.
yeah,
Like a building code nowadays, though?
But it is, but we're talking about existing buildings. Nobody comes into your
Right.
house and makes you put GFCIs in
yeah,
after
but
the
if you
fact.
do a renovation and upgrade your bathroom, then you have to
That's
meet
right,
this
that's
code,
right,
because we
absolutely.
did when we did our bathroom,
Yep.
the same with the kitchen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but so you're saying number 4, that each short-term rental provides that any receptacle within 6 feet of a sink must be GFI, as opposed to the way this is worded,
That's
that
right.
requires one within 6 feet.
That's right. Yep. And then I did print out what I thought were the correct locations based on like today's international codes for the smoke detectors and the carbon monoxide detectors. I don't think it's written correctly the way that it is. And I'm happy to, but I printed these
That
out.
would be great. Thank you.
Yep, and obviously, these are the international codes right off the international website, but, you can disregard like the zoning districts there, because obviously they're not our zoning districts, but this is, the locations of smoke detectors, and then the exact language for carbon monoxide alarms, where they should be installed, and then there's an additional, requirement if there's a fuel burning appliance in the bedroom or in the bathroom attached to the bedroom.
So we would change the wordings in D about these to match.
That's what I would like to
Yeah.
see.
Okay, so backing up to B.
So if we're making some of these things duplicative, why can't we just put that in for all of them?
Well, I think Joe just said because they are specific.
This is already in for everything
It's
else.
already written, but it's not already in the code for short-term rentals, which tend to be in single-family homes, which are not subject to those things. Whereas anything that's defined as a commercial space like a B and B or a hotel or an inn has to meet those codes.
But to get the business license, can't we just make that as a requirement that they need to follow all this stuff? And it'll be the same for all this stuff?
Well, they do, right?
They have to get inspections, yes. but
So if they don't
even
pass the
if it's
inspections, then
more-
you can't move forward.
Then they don't get their license.
Right.
So can't we just put that all on the application? They need to have this, and this?
Yeah, that's already
But
there.
that doesn't have to be part of this.
Right.
Right, so if it's already there and they need to fill that all out to pass, why do we have to have it here?
Because single-family homes are different.
Well, no, we're saying that they need to fill this stuff out. Can't we just say they need to get a business license, fill it out before they can have a short-term rental? And if they don't pass, then they can't do it?
So you're saying make this part of the licensing application instead of codifying it?
Right, we put it in there, and if they don't follow that, then they don't get the license. And
We
then
have
it's
to put
That's
it in.
fine, but then there's no enforcement.
There's no, and we can't justify it if they say, well, why do I have to do this? It's not in your code.
But
And it's
then
not
it doesn't
required
get
now.
approved. But if it doesn't get approved, then they can't do it.
But
But
what's
then
the
they're
harm?
gonna sue you because
Yeah.
you're implying, making rules.
I have
and
one
not-
rationale for putting it.
Impeding
And,
their
and the
business.
other thing, Andrew, is you have different employees doing different inspections, they have different opinions. When you codify it, you know what I mean, there's the rules for somebody to follow.
You can't have something on an application that's not required in the code.
I'm sorry, I'm still having a hard time why we just can't do it for all of these.
Because the others are already covered.
How do I know that? How?
Well, you're,
Well, I mean, I could send you the fire prevention regulations.
But you're-
Understood.
inspector, you don't have to know that. The fire
Yeah.
inspector has to know.
And the person opening it up is gonna find out as soon as they go to apply for a license.
If they don't already know, yeah.
They're gonna already know.
Within the, I do not agree with the last one, number 5, with the all true parking requirements.
Oh, the 3 or less bedrooms, 1 space for the short-term rentals.
Joe, you would eliminate altogether?
I
No,
would
no
eliminate
special
number
requirements?
E5 for parking, yes.
There are no parking requirements for short-term rentals.
But
That's just my opinion. I
agree.
agree that if you're only occupying a short-term rental 50% of the time, like, I mean, you have less parking than any other house in the city, probably.
right,
So does eliminating it there, take it, it's still in, I think, Mr. Hoffman, you mentioned that it's in the code, right?
for B and Bs.
So your structure, and so take a step back, if you were to build your home, whatever your home is, it's going to be subject to whatever your off-street parking is. But here in this situation, you already have your home, and your home has put your parking, or it doesn't have your parking, whatever is allowed under code. What B5 would have done is it would have said, regardless of your parking situation, compliance with your parking situation, if you're gonna get a short-term rental license, you need to show that you have at least as enumerated. If you take that out, then your parking is what it is, and there's no extra check to confirm parking
For short-term
or
rental.
short-term rental.
So it does not take it away from B and Bs.
Correct.
That's a different part.
Correct.
Right. And then can we back up to B, about this, the requiring a local contact? I have no problem with all that. But the final sentence, the local contact shall also be required to maintain records of all short-term rental booking dates and rental income and shall provide such information to the city council upon request or city. Which, from what you said, Mr. Hoffman, that's problematic legally because we have no grounds for requesting that information.
The rental income is, I think the only difference would be your booking dates would be relevant if you are keeping the 270-day requirement.
Right.
If you're not gonna have the 270-day requirement, then that would
Right,
go away.
right. But you think in terms of Ms. Matterway's point about data and analyzing what's happening in the city as a result of this ordinance and any changes, we could get that aggregate lodging data from the state to get a sense of how many people and how much money and so forth, at least all combined.
We
not-
can confirm that, but I would believe that would be publicly available.
And I almost think that whole last sentence should be deleted.
Yeah,
In my opinion, the point of emergency contact is to get somebody to the place right away. There's a problem, there's a fire, there's disruptive tenants.
right,
It's not to sit there and say, oh, here's the booking dates, or here's the other information that we're looking, you know what I mean? It's to take care of the problem immediately, whatever the
Right,
problem
right.
is. So I would rather have somebody, you know what I mean, there that can handle the emergency and not have to worry about them, you know what I mean, knowing about all the rental income and all that type of stuff. I'm not saying the property owner shouldn't be able to provide that information to us. I just don't think a local contact is the person we want to do that.
so we're suggesting deleting that final sentence from section B.
I agree.
Yeah.
I have that note.
Okay, section C, that they have to post a placard with the information and the local contact. Oh, well, the location of the required off-street parking. If we're taking out the requirement for off-street parking, then we would eliminate that. Obviously, they need to know how to contact the emergency contact, fire extinguishers, waste and recycle bins pickup schedule. So if somebody was there for several weeks and they're putting out their trash, they know what to do. And then building requirements. You suggested, Mr. Day, some rewording to be more consistent with the building code.
That's right.
And you
Yep.
gave that to Mr. Hoffman.
Yep.
And you're striking them 5.
Yes, striking 5.
And then 6, the lockbox or a keypad, which would be accessible. I mean, yeah, people have to be able to get in, basically. Prohibitions.
But
No
does 6 mean you can't show up and hand them a key?
Yeah.
The challenge is I think it's that local contact piece. It's making sure that the local contact has the ability to access.
I think that was also, being at some of the planning commission meetings, please correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Rain. Fire Chief Dave Mayeski mentioned that in terms of accessibility in the event of emergencies.
Right,
And,
that's
so I
true.
think that was a point that he specifically mentioned.
right. So if
Because
somebody,
they can give a lockbox number, although if it changes, then that's the issue. You can give that to 911 though, right?
Well, you can, but there's a couple of problems with the way that it's worded. When I read this and I say, yeah, there's a lockbox, that means when I rent the Airbnb, and I've done this many times, I go and put the number in and I get the key out.
right,
Once I get the key out, it's the only key to get in. This
right,
doesn't say anything about emergency access, you know what I mean? And I'm not opposed to that, but this to me means that the person who's renting it can go there, not have any interaction with any person and get in and out of the house.
right.
Now, you could have a keypad on the door, you know what I mean? But generally, even with those keypads on the door, they change them for every tenant, so somebody couldn't come back in the house.
Right.
So it would be like a rolling number, so it wouldn't be the same number that you could give. But that was just my impression after reading
But
it.
do we have that requirement for any other scenario? You don't have that for rentals. Or stuff like that, so.
And it-
But if you wanted to do this for the fire department, you could clear it up and just require them to have a Knox box. That's only a fire department access Knox box. They make residential boxes, they go in the house, they're kind of nondescript. That would clear up the issue because they would be the only one using a Knox box.
Is that what you
I don't
recall
know
the
what that is,
context
but I
being?
like
I
that
think
idea.
that makes more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't write it, but I believe that's what the context was.
I mean, if somebody, let's say somebody, a guest passes out in the house or is having a heart attack and they call 911. If the emergency personnel can't get into the house, they're gonna break down the door.
Right,
Halligan Bar Works wonders.
So it would seem to me that it would be beneficial to the owner to have this because then they could access to help the person without knocking down the door.
What does something like that cost?
For a residential box, you're talking between $300 and $400. but they're very heavy duty.
Mhm.
And the only people that have keys to them are the fire department.
And it's a one-time expense.
And it's only, Goodwill only has a key for the Knox boxes in their district.
Okay.
So it isn't even like another
And-
fire company would come in, it's Goodwill's Knox box key,
And it's called a Knox box?
KNOX, yes.
Oh, I've never heard that.
Yep.
No, no,
There's a lot of places around that have them, you just don't notice them, because usually they put them in areas that, you know what I
Aren't
mean?
obvious, yeah.
And the fire department's fine.
Yep, yep.
Well, they know. where-
Well, Knox
General.
notifies, so when you order one of these, Knox notifies the fire company, and the fire company has to sign off on it. On where it's going, the address, make sure to confirm it's the right company, so they have the right key, and then when the owner gets the box, the fire department has to go out there and unlock the box for them. You know what I mean? So they can install it and everything, so it's actually a pretty good system.
So isn't that something?
Sounds like a good idea for somebody who lives by themselves.
Absolutely.
That's what I'm thinking.
Isn't that something we want our bed and breakfast and inn to probably have too?
Absolutely, I mean, I would say,
The thing is, there's
But-
more people,
Theoretically.
theoretically, there are other people on the premises who could open the door.
There might be, the Terry House may already have one, and we just don't know where it is.
I know Goodwill has a program, and they went out to a lot of places that have Knox boxes, you just probably don't realize it.
Yeah, because they're indescript. They're not meant to stand out and go, no, it's small.
Right.
Well, yeah, that's a good idea.
So I am deleting 6 as drafted, but rewriting to include the Knox box.
Was that KNOX?
Yep.
Okay, and then the prohibitions, they can't use it for commercial activities.
Yeah.
They can't be an RV park on the
Back.
street. Now, here's the 270 days, and we already had a proposed amendment to eliminate that.
Yes,
And I
We
think
should
we're,
just delete 3.
just delete 3.
yeah, okay. And then the next is the 2.5% of the total, and we've already discussed changing that to 1 for only the 4 residential districts, not the,
The other ones are just exempt from this, right? Or can
They're
have
just-
unlimited.
Unlimited number.
if we don't include them in the limit, then they are by definition
Like-
limited, right? Okay, and then any violation of this, they could lose their license. If they advertise without proper licensing, advertising short-term rental outside the permitted scope of the rental license, I'm not quite sure what that means. Oh, just out of curiosity, I went through Airbnb listings for Newcastle and VRBO listings for Newcastle. I found only the ones that we're aware of. Someone said to me, well, there's at least one Airbnb not in the downtown area, but in one of the surrounding neighborhoods. I didn't find any. Now, there's a number of them that have Newcastle addresses, but they're not in the city. There's 2 in Collins Park, which may be what this person was confused by, because that's kind of,
The chief mentioned something over in Boothurst, but it was a room that they were renting out to someone.
but that's different
Yeah,
than,
that's different.
And you're permitted to do that.
You are permitted.
you know, that's right. It says something about a 1 room to one person or something is already permitted. So at any rate, I don't think we have a huge number of unknown Airbnbs, Verbos hanging out in Newcastle.
And just remember, there's no requirement out there. So
Yeah.
people who are currently operating are not in violation. As long
Except
as
they
they
didn't
have a
get a
rental
business,
license.
if they got a
Right.
if they got a business license and a rental license.
So in 3A, we have a warning, we have a misspelling, written warning. So missing an N,
Oh, yeah,
the 3rd line.
it's just a spelling error.
Yep. So in B, in 3B, each day a violation continues. I think unresolved is redundant. Each day a violation continues will constitute a separate violation.
Great.
And Mike, I think backing up to G, what is a disorderly dwelling? Section, there is a definition of that in section 140-41. Would that also apply to this?
This gets back to our definition question, right? So the the short answer, and I'm looking at G here, where's the?
Page
Up
nine.
here, got it, you have to sort it, right. So again, what you would do is you would look at context, so you would first look to the zoning code, does the zoning code define disorderly dwelling? If it doesn't, then you would have to look at other examples to gauge the intent. So that's how you would do that. Would you end up in 140? If that's where the context takes you, then yes.
I mean, would it be helpful to say disorderly dwelling as defined in section 140-41?
If that's your intent, yes. Yep.
Yes, it's gonna be great.
Yeah, I think we touched on that briefly last time, and we talked about C as being boilerplate, sort of legalese. And the city's gonna keep record of the licensing, obviously. And publish the active lists issued licenses by addresses and unit numbers only on the city website.
Why?
Why? Yeah, we
Why?
don't publish other business licenses.
That was the request of the planning commission directly, that.
And why is that? Do you recall why they wanted that
I
published?
just think somebody wanted to know that.
But why? What, do we have a right to know that our neighbor has a business license?
I don't.
G.
I think you should take it out.
Yeah, and
If they have
Yeah.
a question, they can call the city. Then they get that information, but it doesn't need to be on a website.
you usually don't put requirements of the jurisdiction in a code. You either do it as a policy or you don't. And websites are traditionally always behind, so.
So we're talking about deleting, just putting a period after license is issued and deleting the rest of that item. Is that-
Well, I think and I agree with Chris, I think striking it entirely because you're regulating yourself.
Yeah, by definition, the city's gonna keep track of the license.
Anyways,
So we're gonna delete that.
The only thing that it's really gonna do is publicize the fact that we've got
Right.
these, and if we wanna do free advertising for people.
Just real quick, back to disorderly dwelling, 141, I'm sorry, 140-41 defines it as disorderly premises, so do we wanna just align the
Okay.
names?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was gonna say, I thought
Matt.
disorderly premises was the right
Yeah.
language, because that's what's used in the state code as
So
well.
instead of dwelling premises,
For section chapter 140 of the code.
And then the rest of it is all the, severability, but then there's the last one about exceptions. Oh, I know, wait a minute, in section 13. Nothing in this ordinance shall be construed as to prevent the renewal of a short-term rental for a period of up to 31 additional days, because in the definition it talks about 30 days. However, provided that no short-term rental shall be occupied by any guest for a period exceeding 62 days. Why?
And then you merge into long-term rental.
Right, but if we've defined short-term rental as,
temporary.
well, we've said 31 days. What happens if the person, is that a violation of the code? Do they need a different license?
I think that the intention here would be that if. As I read this, if your intention is to have this unit that is essentially on a month-to-month lease, then it's not subject to the short-term,
Right.
the requirement to get a license or anything like that. And I think what this is saying is it's one thing to say, I've got this short-term rental and it's for this 31-day period. I've got somebody who comes out of nowhere and wants it 2 months, great, and I'm still gonna regulate that. If you get somebody who's in 3 months or beyond that, then you shouldn't be subject to these requirements. You can make that, so will a council can say, no, if you start out as a short-term rental and you're continuing on, we want to keep you subject to this. But I think that the intention here is that that's a one-off situation. And the preference is if you're getting into lease terms that long, that they shouldn't be subject to this.
Well, right, and it would be, for the owner, it would be advantageous to be considered long-term instead of short-term because they don't have to meet as many of these other rules.
So 408 Delaware Street, which is the Athertons,
Because they-
and sometimes it goes for a couple days, a week, sometimes months.
Right, that's the one where like traveling nurses and contractors working
Yeah.
for DuPont or,
But really, once you get to that 62 days, actually, the regulations are less after that.
right,
We're done regulating you as a short-term rental.
right.
So to that point, I don't think you're going to end up with a situation where somebody's going to say all of a sudden that if they've got that long term, that all of a sudden because then they could just have a longer term lease.
So in other words, you don't think this is causing any particular
I
problem?
don't. I think it's just making clear that that the intention is that these short-term rentals really are short-term rentals.
And how do we monitor that?
That's going to be the code enforcement. And so, I mean, just with anything, it's gonna be,
And what would we be, all right, let's say, okay, the neighbor reports they've had the same guy in that short-term rental for 90 days. Okay, that means they're subject to less restrictions than if the.
It's just like a regular rental in
Just
the
like
block.
a long-term.
Any other long-term rental on the block.
but it's no different than any other code. So then that becomes and so, but I think the example you just outlined is why I don't think it's gonna be an issue. Just.
I mean, it says if they violate the code, they could lose their their rental license, but if they say, okay, I'll have long-term rental, that's a license too, so. Okay,
In exemptions, we need to probably strike again the off-street parking.
yeah. Okay, so we strike that whole sentence, any short-term retail operation is. And any bed and breakfast for keeping the short parking, so it's just the first sentence that gets eliminated.
For short-term rental.
Yeah.
What about all short-term rentals and bed and breakfast? The last line.
Of 90 days to comply.
So
Yeah,
this
'cause then they
box
have
that we're
90
looking to have them, what kind of time frame does it take to get one of those installed?
Yeah, I mean, couple weeks, you
Yeah.
order it and they get approval.
Okay, so 90 days. is
Oh,
still
90 days.
Reasonable then, I agree.
But what about, okay, well, we don't have any bed and breakfast in operation, so the parking for them isn't an issue. Anybody opening a B and B is gonna know that they have to provide parking. And as long as they know it going in, that's different than imposing it on them after.
And the truth is, I mean, like was brought up, I mean, anybody can go to the Board of Adjustment and get a variance too, I mean. It's understandable.
So. You think we're ready to have a relatively clean discussion?
Brian. Do you have any questions that you want to bring up now or whatever board meeting? Now's the time.
You are free to ask questions whenever you want to ask questions.
So then next week, we will have to go through and vote on each of these amendments.
No, so what I can do is I will revise the ordinance to include all of these, so you're gonna have a clean ordinance. Now, what we can do is I'll provide a red line that shows what has changed in the clean ordinance versus what was the ordinance prior to this workshop, so people can look and you all can say, here's what we've done. But if the will of council be to adopt it, then you can just simply adopt the.
The whole thing.
revised, right.
All right. Anybody else have anything they want to say tonight?
This was very much needed.
Oh, yes, thank you for.
This is on Mondays.
Yes, it is. It's on Monday, November 11th. Remember, we changed it because.
Monday the
Yeah,
10th.
The 10th.
That email.
Of course, I still sent it. out.
Yeah.
Are we doing?
Not in this that.
So is there a motion to adjourn?
Listen to them.
Second,
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
German.
The motion is, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you, Marika.
You